On a February afternoon as snow began to blanket the streets, Melissa Wilson gazed out her office window, waiting for a call from her sister. As a creative director at an advertising agency, her desk was piled high with projects facing imminent deadlines, but today her mind was elsewhere. The phone rang, and Melissa took a deep breath before answering. "Jenny." "Mel, I'm getting married." Jennifer Thompson's voice trembled with excitement. "Bradley proposed. We're having the ceremony the last weekend in May." Melissa smiled. "Congratulations, truly. Bradley is a wonderful man. Mom and Dad are already making a fuss and are absolutely thrilled. Mom especially is acting like she's joining the royal family herself, now that we're connecting with the Collins family." Melissa couldn't help but narrow her eyes. Her mother Barbara had always been a woman who valued appearances and social status. Bradley Collins came from one of the oldest wealthy families on the East Coast. And Melissa's ex-husband David had been the complete opposite. "So, are Danny and I invited?" Melissa asked lightly. But behind the question lay years of accumulated pain. There was a moment of silence on the other end. "Of course, Mel. You're my sister, and Danny is my nephew. But. Mom's been saying things about the seating arrangements. She seems to want to place you and Danny somewhere less visible." Melissa bit her lip. Since her divorce 7 years ago, Barbara had viewed her and Daniel as the family's failures. The daughter who married a man with common blood and produced a problem child. "I understand, Jenny. We'll be there no matter what. The location doesn't matter." That evening, while having dinner with her 14-year-old son Daniel, Melissa discussed her sister's wedding. Daniel poked at the food on his plate with his fork, wearing a gloomy expression. "I don't want to go if Grandma's going to be there," Daniel muttered. Melissa placed her hand over her son's. "Danny, you're stronger than you think. And no matter what anyone says about you, I'm proud of you." Daniel looked up, meeting his mother's eyes. "I know you'll protect me, Mom. But I just don't understand why Grandma dislikes us so much." Melissa sighed deeply. "Grandma is a difficult person. She has an image of a perfect family, and when she feels we don't fit that image, she can't accept it." The following weekend, Melissa visited her father Marcus's home. Unlike her mother, her father had a gentle personality. However, he tended to give in to Barbara's strong personality and avoid family conflicts. "Dad, I want to talk about Jenny's wedding," Melissa began in her father's study. Marcus removed his glasses and looked at his daughter with tired eyes. "Ah, your mother is making all sorts of plans. The Collins family values tradition very highly." "It's about Danny," Melissa continued quietly. "I heard that Mom is trying to exclude him from the ceremony." Marcus closed his eyes. "It's not that, Mel. She just wants to place him somewhere less noticeable." "Dad." Melissa's voice grew stronger. "Danny hasn't done anything wrong. The way he's being treated is unfair." Marcus stared at his daughter silently before saying in a low voice, "I understand. But you know your mother. She's what? A control freak. Cruel. She only knows her own way," Marcus answered in a weary voice. "Besides, this time there's the relationship with the Collins family to consider. William Collins is someone who places great importance on tradition and family history." Melissa stood up. "I understand, Dad. But Danny is my son. I'll do whatever it takes to protect him." As she was leaving, Melissa ran into Barbara in the living room. Her mother was wearing an elegant dress, obviously preparing for a social engagement. "Oh, Melissa. Make sure Daniel dresses properly for the ceremony. What would the Collins family think if he showed up with that strange haircut and slovenly clothes?" Melissa took a deep breath. Mom, Danny is a fine young man. The problem isn't his haircut or clothes, it's your attitude. Barbara gave a cold smile. You always play the victim. I'm just trying to protect the family's reputation. Melissa left the house in silence. Getting into her car and gripping the steering wheel, she made a firm decision. No matter what happened at her sister's wedding, she would protect her son. On the last Saturday in May, preparations for the Collins-Thompson wedding were well underway at a historic cathedral in suburban Boston. Melissa parked her rental car in the parking lot and looked at Daniel in the passenger seat. Her son was anxiously gazing out the window. Danny, are you okay? Melissa asked gently. Daniel answered while tugging at his tie. I'm fine. Just worried that Grandma might say something. Melissa placed her hand on her son's shoulder. Whatever happens, we're in this together. Today is my sister's special day, so let's try to keep the peace as much as possible. When they entered the church, they were captivated by the lavish decorations. The altar adorned with white roses and green leaves, crystal chandeliers, and a red carpet laid down the central aisle. Everything was perfectly arranged. Melissa. Daniel. Turning around, they saw Marcus approaching with a smile. He was dressed formally and seemed a bit more tense than usual. Dad, you look wonderful, Melissa hugged her father. Thank you. You both look lovely too. Marcus patted Daniel's shoulder. You've grown into a fine young man, Daniel. Daniel smiled shyly. Thanks, Grandpa. Marcus looked around and said in a low voice, the reception hall is over there. The seating chart is at the entrance. The ceremony will start soon, so you should find your seats. Melissa and Daniel headed for the hall. At the entrance was a large seating chart decorated with the names and table numbers of the guests in beautiful calligraphy. Melissa searched for her and Daniel's names and found table 14 toward the back. Well, as expected, Melissa whispered. As far from the main table as possible. When they approached table 14, several elderly relatives were already seated. As Melissa found her seat, next to it was a place card labeled Daniel Wilson. However, there was a small note on the card. Cleaning staff. Melissa froze. In her mind, anger and disbelief mixed together. Daniel had already noticed. The color drained from his face, and he bit his lip hard. Hey, what is this? Melissa picked up the place card and asked a nearby relative. The elderly woman wore a confused expression. Well, I don't. Oh, Melissa, you finally arrived. Barbara approached elegantly, wrapped in a glamorous dress. Her smile was perfect, but a cold light dwelled in her eyes. Mom, what is the meaning of this? Melissa showed her the place card. Barbara raised her voice so others could hear and said with a laugh, I'd appreciate the help. We need young people's energy. Especially, energetic children like Daniel. The relatives at the table chuckled softly, and Daniel's face reddened at the sound. He gritted his teeth and stared fixedly at the floor. Melissa stared at Barbara, sensing the malice hidden behind her shallow smile. Slowly, Melissa picked up the place card and took out her smartphone from her bag. She pressed the record button and, holding the phone in her hand, said quietly. Mom, if this is a joke, it's in very poor taste. Barbara shrugged slightly. Oh, you're being too sensitive. I just thought it would be good to have him help with the cleanup after the ceremony. Don't children like Daniel need to be given some responsibility? I heard he's been causing problems at school. Melissa replied while maintaining her composure, Danny hasn't caused any problems at school. In fact, he received the top award in his grade last year. Well, that's your version, Barbara said without changing her tone. But the Collins family has certain standards. They value lineage and cultivation. Quite different from the path you chose. At this point, Melissa noticed people who appeared to be Colin's family members watching with uncomfortable expressions from several tables away. In particular, a dignified white-haired man, presumably William Collins, was frowning. Melissa held her smartphone firmly and said in a clear voice, "Mom, you've always heard us like this. But today, I'm going to document it." Barbara's expression clouded for a moment. "How ridiculous, you can't take a joke. You're too sensitive, Melissa." "A joke?" Melissa held up the place card. "This is a joke. Humiliating my son." Barbara looked around and lowered her voice. "That's enough. Today is Jennifer's day. You always think only about yourself." At this moment, Daniel, who had been silent until now, slowly stood up. He was already taller than his grandmother and looked straight into her eyes. "Grandma," his voice was quiet but somehow powerful. "I'm not the person you think I am." Barbara looked up at her grandson, momentarily speechless. "I'm proud of my mom. She raised me by herself and works at a successful company. Yet you look down on us. That's wrong." The room fell silent. People at nearby tables had stopped their conversations and were looking in their direction. William Collins was giving instructions to a staff member, who hurriedly left the room. Barbara's face reddened with anger, but before she could say anything, a sobbing sound was heard. Turning around, they saw Jennifer standing there in her bridal gown. Her eyes were red with tears, and her hands were trembling. "Mom, how could you do this?" Jennifer's voice was shaking. "Today is my wedding day. Yet you do such terrible things." Bradley Collins appeared behind the bride, supporting her shoulder. His expression was stern, clearly suppressing his anger. Barbara walked toward her daughter. "Jenny, it's not like that. It's just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Jennifer pushed away her mother's hand. "I heard everything. I saw that you're being recorded." The murmuring in the venue grew louder, and William Collins approached. He looked sternly at Barbara before turning to Melissa. "We will discuss this matter thoroughly after the ceremony." His voice was calm but full of authority. "Today is an important day for my son and your sister." Melissa took a deep breath and stopped the recording. "Yes, let's prioritize my sister's happiness now." She placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder, quietly encouraging him to return to his seat. Daniel nodded with mature composure and sat down. Melissa stroked the words, "cleaning staff," on the place card with her finger and put it in her bag. Barbara stood there stunned, looking alternately at her daughters and grandson. She seemed to sense that her perfect plan was beginning to crumble. Jennifer wiped her tears in Bradley's arms and nodded slightly. "Let's start the ceremony," she said. But this isn't over. The ceremony somehow concluded without a hitch. Melissa watched as Jennifer made her vows as a beautiful bride and couldn't help tearing up. Putting aside her own complicated feelings, she wanted to genuinely celebrate her sister's happiness in this moment. Daniel sat quietly beside her, absorbed in the solemn ceremony. The reception was held at a prestigious country club in suburban Boston. As champagne was poured and the orchestra played gentle music, Melissa and Daniel tried to remain inconspicuous in the crowd. After the incident at the ceremony, Barbara seemed to be avoiding them, though she occasionally cast cold glances in their direction. "Melissa Wilson." A low, composed voice came from behind Melissa. Turning around, she saw William Collins standing there. He carried himself with dignity in his perfectly tailored suit. "I'd like to speak with you. Would you mind?" Melissa gently stroked Daniel's shoulder. "Danny, would you wait at our table for a moment?" Daniel nodded and quietly replied, "Sure, Mom." Melissa followed William, and they entered a small reception room at the country club. Bradley was already seated there, along with Jennifer, who still showed traces of tears. Please, sit down, William said calmly but authoritatively. Could you show me the recording from earlier? Melissa hesitated a bit, then took out her smartphone. Is this really necessary? Today is Jenny and Bradley's special day. That's precisely why, William answered quietly. From today, we become one family. And I have very clear ideas about what family means. Melissa took a deep breath and played the recording. Barbara's cold mockery, the insulting place card put at Daniel's seat, and her mother's explanations that explained nothing. When the recording ended, the room was enveloped in heavy silence. This isn't the first time, is it? William's voice was quiet, but anger resided in his eyes. No, Melissa answered honestly. Mother has treated Daniel and me this way for years. Especially since my divorce. Why? Melissa shrugged. In my mother's eyes, I'm a failure. Because I couldn't realize the perfect life she wanted for me, a wealthy husband, connections to a prominent family. Jennifer suddenly spoke up. Mel, I didn't, no. Of course you wouldn't, Jenny, Melissa smiled gently. Mother showed a different face to you. You were always her pride. The door opened, and Marcus came in. His face looked exhausted. William, I heard you called for me. Yes, Marcus, William stood up and shook hands. I want to discuss your wife's behavior. Marcus looked at his daughter and sighed. Melissa, did you show him the recording? Dad, there's no need to hide anything. It's time we faced the truth. Marcus sat heavily in a chair. You're right, enough is enough. At that moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. The father who had always just followed his wife's opinions was showing a different face for the first time. Barbara has treated Melissa and Daniel unfairly for years, Marcus said quietly but firmly. It started with small things. Criticism of Melissa's choices, interference in Daniel's education. But after the divorce, it became obvious harassment. Jennifer's eyes widened. Dad. You wouldn't know, Jenny, Marcus smiled gently at his daughter. Mother showed you a different face. You were her success story. Marcus took a folded paper from his pocket. Actually, I have evidence. Melissa looked at her father in surprise. Dad. This is a copy of a letter Barbara sent to Melissa's ex-husband. Marcus handed the paper to William. When David was about to be promoted at his company, Barbara sent an anonymous letter to his boss, damaging David's reputation. As a result, the promotion was cancelled, and cracks formed in their marriage. That can't be true. Jennifer gasped. It is, Marcus nodded sadly. That's not all. Barbara also interfered at Daniel's school. When he was scheduled to be honored as an outstanding student, Barbara called the principal, trying to make Daniel seem like a problem child. Melissa covered her mouth with a trembling hand. I didn't know. I'm sure you didn't, Marcus nodded. I didn't fully understand the situation until recently. But after retiring and having more time, I began to notice Barbara's behavior. And I started collecting evidence. William reviewed the documents and placed them down with a severe expression. This is unacceptable. Family should support and protect each other. Such destructive behavior. The door suddenly opened, and Barbara entered. She wore a perfect smile, but when she sensed the room's atmosphere, her expression froze. What are you discussing? She looked around at the people in the room. The truth, Barbara. Marcus stood up and faced his wife. No more secrets. Barbara stared at her husband, then glanced at the documents on the desk. The color drained from her face. Marcus, what are you? I should not have silently witnessed your actions. Marcus's voice was filled with sadness. Melissa and Daniel are not the people you've portrayed them to be. Melissa runs a successful business, and Daniel excels in school. Barbara became defensive. You don't understand anything. I was only thinking about the family. That's a lie, Mom. Melissa quietly stood up. You've been doing this for yourself. Because my life didn't fit the picture you painted, you tried to exclude me and Danny. William looked sternly at Barbara. Mrs. Thompson, I value the honor and dignity of the Collins family above all else. And I believe that family bonds are most important. Exactly. Barbara desperately agreed. I also believe. However, William cut off her words, your actions are destroying family bonds. This is unacceptable. Bradley spoke for the first time. His voice contained anger. My father is right. We don't want to be involved with a family that holds such values. What? Barbara said in a trembling voice. Jennifer stood up and said while wiping away her tears, Mom, I love Bradley. But how can we be happy in this kind of family relationship? Barbara stared at her daughter, at a loss for words for the first time. She could feel her perfectly planned world crumbling before her eyes. At that moment, Daniel peeked in from the doorway. He hesitantly entered the room and stood near his grandfather. Grandpa, are you okay? Marcus embraced his grandson's shoulders and replied, Yes, I'm fine, Daniel. Barbara stared at Daniel and for the first time saw the hurt and strength reflected in his eyes. And she began to understand, ever so slightly, what she had done. William stood up and solemnly said, Let me be clear. The Collins family is one that values family bonds and mutual respect above all else. Mrs. Barbara Thompson, your actions are incompatible with our values. Barbara grabbed the edge of the table with trembling hands. William, this is an internal family matter. An outsider shouldn't. I am no longer an outsider, William said calmly. Today, we became family. And I will not tolerate anyone who has a harmful influence on my family. Bradley stood next to his father and took Jennifer's hand. I love Jenny. I want to walk through life with her. But it's difficult in this situation. What do you mean? Barbara's voice was high and trembling. The meaning is clear, William said strictly. We support Jennifer and Bradley's marriage. However, Mrs. Barbara, there are conditions regarding our relationship with you. The room fell silent. Jennifer wept as she leaned against Bradley's arm. We are giving you an ultimatum, William continued sternly. Unless Barbara refrains from attending family events and completely stops harassing Melissa and Daniel, the Collins family will not officially recognize this marriage. That's blackmail. Barbara cried out. No, this is setting boundaries, William replied coolly. Unless your behavior changes, you will not be invited to future Collins family gatherings. Even if Bradley and Jennifer have children, you may not be able to meet your grandchildren. Barbara stood dumbfounded, then turned to Jennifer. Jenny, you'll allow this? Cutting your mother off from the family? Jennifer raised her tear-stained face. Mom, I love you. But your actions toward Melissa and Danny are too cruel. Why do you hurt your own daughter and grandson so much? You don't understand. Barbara's voice shook with anger and fear. I was only trying to protect the family. Melissa chose to betray the family's expectations. Marcus slowly stood up. His face showed determination. Barbara, enough. For years, I've silently watched your behavior. But I can't continue this any longer. Marcus. I've consulted with a lawyer, Marcus said quietly. I intend to start divorce proceedings. The color drained from Barbara's face. What? You're going to throw away 40 years of marriage. You threw it away, Barbara, Marcus said sadly. With poisonous words and actions, bit by bit, you've destroyed our family. Enough is enough. Barbara looked around the room. She could feel her perfectly planned life crumbling before her eyes. She suddenly ran toward the door and left the room. After a heavy silence filled the room, Melissa slowly approached her father. "Dad, are you serious?" Marcus displayed a tired smile. "Yes, I am. I should have done it sooner. I'm truly sorry, Melissa. For not protecting you and Daniel." Melissa embraced her father. "You protected us now." William cleared his throat and said, "Now, let's discuss how to proceed. As a representative of the Collins family, I accept Melissa and Daniel as family. As for Barbara..." The reception somehow continued as scheduled. The bride and groom danced, cut the cake, and received words of blessing. However, Barbara was nowhere to be seen, and small murmurs spread among the guests. The next day, Melissa was having breakfast with Daniel in their hotel room. They were quietly discussing the previous day's events. "Mom, what will happen to Grandma?" Daniel asked. Melissa looked at her son's worried face. "I don't know. But Grandma will have to face the consequences of her actions." "I don't hate Grandma," Daniel said quietly. "I was just sad." "But hatred doesn't solve anything, right?" Melissa was surprised and proud of her son's mature thinking. "Danny, you're so wise." At that moment, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, Marcus was standing there. He looked tired, but there was a new light in his eyes. "May I come in?" Melissa invited her father in. Marcus sat across from Daniel and accepted a cup of coffee. "Barbara went to her sister's house last night," Marcus said quietly. "I've spoken with my lawyer and started preparing the division of property." "Are you really getting divorced?" Melissa asked. Marcus nodded. "It might take time, but my decision is firm. I also plan to change my estate planning. I'll leave Barbara the legal minimum and distribute the rest equally among you." "Dad, the money isn't..." "Not an issue, I know," Marcus smiled. "But this is a matter of justice. And I'm also thinking about Daniel's future." Daniel looked at his grandfather in surprise. Marcus took his grandson's hand across the table. "Daniel, yesterday I was moved by your courage. Seeing you face your grandmother not with anger but with dignity made me proud." Daniel smiled shyly. "I just told the truth." "That's the hardest thing to do," Marcus said seriously. "You'll grow into a wonderful young man. And I want to be there to see it." That afternoon, Jennifer and Bradley came to visit. Before departing for their honeymoon, they wanted to see Melissa and Daniel. "My parents said," Bradley said, "that they want to welcome you as family." Apparently, they were impressed by Daniel's dignified attitude. Jennifer hugged Melissa. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "Don't worry about it," Melissa rubbed her sister's back. "It's not your fault. But things will be different from now on," Jennifer said with determination. "We'll be a real family. I don't know what will happen with Mother, but I'll cherish you and Danny." A year later, on a bright terrace in suburban Boston, Melissa watched Jennifer holding a baby. Jennifer and Bradley's daughter Emma had been born just 2 months ago. Sunlight illuminated the baby's soft cheeks, and the laughter of family members echoed around them. "She really is like an angel," Melissa said with a smile. Daniel had grown even taller. He was watching with interest as Marcus and Bradley set up a new barbecue grill in the garden. Last year, Daniel had won the top prize in the Boston area science competition and had received scholarship offers from prestigious high schools. His confidence grew daily, and the shadow of the once wounded boy was fading. "Mel, look," Jennifer handed over a magazine. "There's a feature article on your design company." Melissa took the magazine. Her advertising design company had grown rapidly over the past year and had gained national attention. In particular, Her campaign focusing on environmental issues had been highly praised and won industry awards. "Dad will be pleased to see this," Melissa said. Marcus's divorce had been finalized last fall, and he now lived a peaceful life. He had started volunteering with the local legal aid society and was passionate about supporting underprivileged children. Recently, he had become close with Carol, a friend from his college days, and had begun inviting her to family gatherings. "Did you read Barbara's letter?" Jennifer asked quietly. Melissa nodded. After the divorce, Barbara had been living with her sister. She had lost much of her standing in social circles, and many of her former friends had distanced themselves from her. Even the church group she belonged to had rejected her after her attitude toward her family came to light. In complete solitude, Barbara was forced to face herself for the first time. 3 months ago, she had begun sessions with a psychological counselor and started exploring the root causes of her behavior patterns. Last week, a letter addressed to Melissa and Daniel had arrived. It contained Barbara's words of apology. "Out of my own fears and anxieties, I hurt what was most precious to me," she had written. The letter also expressed a hope to meet, but Melissa had not yet replied. "What are you going to do?" Jennifer asked. Melissa looked across the garden, her eyes resting on Daniel and Marcus talking and smiling. "I don't know yet. Forgiveness takes time. But I don't intend to close the door completely," Melissa said quietly. "As Danny said, holding on to resentment doesn't solve anything. Someday, we might be able to build a new relationship with Mom." Little Emma woke up in Jennifer's arms and began to cry softly. Melissa gently touched her niece's cheek. "The beginning of a new family," Melissa smiled. The sunshine enveloped them, and a peaceful atmosphere filled the terrace. While the wounds of the past might not be completely healed, hope for the future certainly existed. And now, they were finally becoming a family in the true sense of the word.